Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story.
The letter arrived folded inside a flame-resistant envelope, which was standard procedure for Draconoth students. Risa held it between two claws and did not open it for a long time. She already knew what it was. Everyone at the academy knew what the red envelope meant. She had seen two students receive one in her first year. Both of them were gone within the week, not expelled, not failed, just quietly reassigned to lesser programs with smiles that did not reach their eyes. The red envelope was the impossible task notice. Risa set it on her sleeping stone and looked out the small window of her dormitory chamber. Outside, the academy campus stretched across the curved surface of Verath 9's second plateau, a wide arrangement of connected domes and open corridors built to hold 50 different species in reasonable comfort. The sky above was a deep green gold, the way it always looked at this hour, and three junior students from the Shren species were chasing each other across the grass field below. Their 6 legs making soft drumming sounds she could feel more than hear. She had been here 2 years. She had passed every test, every simulation, every field assessment. Her marks in Xenosystems theory were the highest in her year group. She had never failed anything. She opened the envelope. The task parameters were printed in plain Academy standard text, clinical and short. She was to design a functional containment field for a triphase energy anomaly. The materials available to her were rated below Class 4 clearance. The anomaly itself required Class 9 shielding at minimum to be contained safely. The deadline was 30 days from receipt. Risa read it twice, then she read it again. The numbers did not change. She found her friend Torn in the stone courtyard outside the science block, sitting with the particular stillness that Gorath students favored, heavy, patient, like a boulder that had decided to think. Torn's surface was a dark gray-green, and small flecks of mineral caught the gold skylight as Risa landed beside him and held out the letter without speaking. Torn read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry, Risa." She took the letter back. "Why are you sorry? I haven't failed yet." "The math doesn't work," Torn said. He was not being unkind. He was simply a Gorath, and Gorath did not soften facts. Class 3 materials cannot contain a Class 9 anomaly. The differential is not close. It is not something that careful engineering can bridge. This task has been given to students for 200 years, and no one has completed it. "Then what is the point of it?" Risa asked. Torn looked at her. "The point is to see how you fail." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about it through the evening meal, through the low hum of the dormitory at night, through the early gray-green of the next morning. And when the academy's schedule brought her to Dale Brin's office for her weekly academic check-in, she put the envelope on his desk before she sat down. Dale Brin was a human, which at the academy still meant something specific, new, unproven, from a species that had only joined the interstellar community 11 years ago and was still treated with polite skepticism by most of the senior faculty. He was not large. He did not carry himself as though he were important. He had a habit of drinking something warm from a small metal container and reading things twice before he responded to them. He read the task parameters twice. Then he set the datapad down, picked up his metal container, and said, "Good." Risa blinked. Her fire glands, still small and not yet fully developed, gave a confused little pulse of warmth. "Good." "This is the interesting kind," Dale said. He did not look worried. He did not look sorry. He looked the way he always looked when she brought him a problem, like the problem had just made his day slightly better. "There is no solution," Risa said carefully. "The math does not allow it. The class differential." "I know what the class differential is," Dale said. He leaned back in his chair. "But before we talk about solutions, I want you to do something first. I want you to write down every material you have access to, every rule listed in those parameters, not summarized, word for word, and every rule about the task that is not written down but is treated as true anyway." Risa stared at him. "Why?" He looked at her over the rim of his container. "Because there is a difference between the rules that exist and the rules that people assume exist, and until we know exactly which is which, we are working blind. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she had been his student long enough to know that Dale Brin did not say things without a reason. So she took the datapad back and she began to write. What she did not know was that across the campus, in the council observation suite, a tall insectoid administrator named Oren was watching the recording of that meeting with his secondary eyes narrowed and his primary eyes very, very still. He had expected the human to offer sympathy. He had expected the Draconoth girl to leave looking smaller than she arrived. Neither of those things had happened. Orin made a note in his records and flagged the session for continued monitoring. The impossible task had been given for 2 centuries. It had never been completed. It was not going to be completed now by a young dragon and a human who had been teaching at this academy for less than 3 years. But he began, quietly, to pay attention. 7 days into the task, Risa had filled 4 datapads with notes and still did not have an answer. But she had something she had not expected to have: questions. Dale had a method. It was not the method taught at the academy. Academy instructors moved from problem to solution in clean lines, identify the constraint, apply the known framework, produce the result. Dale moved sideways. He circled problems the way Risa had once watched a dust storm circle the southern plateau before it finally committed to a direction. He started with the words. On the 8th day, he pulled up the task parameters on the wide display board in his office and went through them line by line, out loud, slowly, the way someone would read a legal document to a jury. Risa sat across from him with a blank notepad and wrote down everything he said. He stopped at the 3rd parameter. "Read that back to me," he said. Risa looked at her notes. All containment materials used must carry a rating below Class 4 clearance as assessed by the Academy's Standard Material Registry. "What does that mean?" Dale asked. "It means I can only use Class 3 materials or lower." "It means," Dale said, "that each individual material must be rated below Class 4. "Yes," he paused. "What does it say about combinations?" Risa looked at the line again. She read it again. She read it a 3rd time. It said nothing about combinations. She felt something shift in her chest, something small and careful, like a coal that was not yet aflame. "That could be a mistake," she said, "an oversight in the wording." "Maybe," Dale said, "or maybe the people who wrote it never considered that 2 Class 3 materials in the right configuration might produce shielding properties that neither material has alone. In engineering, we call that emergent behavior. The whole behaves differently from the sum of its parts." Risa was quiet for a moment. "Is that real? Does that actually happen with shielding materials?" "I don't know yet," Dale said. "That's why we're going to test it." She looked up at him. "You want to run experiments?" "I want you to run experiments," he said. "I'll help you design them, but this is your task and your documentation. Every step needs to be yours." The first test was simple, almost embarrassingly small. 2 of the most stable Class 3 materials available in the Academy's open access supply rooms, a compressed resonance polymer and a layered mineral sheet used mainly in student geology projects, arranged in a specific overlapping configuration and exposed to a controlled low-level energy discharge in the junior lab. The shielding held for 0.4 seconds at a level that neither material could sustain alone. 0.4 seconds was nothing. It was not close to what the task required, but it was not 0. Risa stared at the readout for a long time. Her fire glands warmed in that involuntary way they did when something surprised her deeply. "That's not supposed to happen," she said. "A lot of important things aren't supposed to happen," Dale said, "until they do." Torn came by the lab that evening. He read over Rice's shoulder, looked at the test results, and then looked at Dale with the slow, careful expression that Gorath reserved for things they were genuinely uncertain about. "The Council has seen creative attempts before," Torn said. "There have been students who tried unusual material arrangements. They were always ruled invalid. Was there a written ruling? Dale asked. Torn paused. I believe so. Can you find it? Torn searched the Academy's open academic archive that night. He was thorough, Gorath always were, stone-patient and methodical. He found records of 14 prior attempts at unconventional solutions. He found the Council's rejections of each one. He did not find a single written policy defining what made an unconventional solution invalid. Every rejection had cited tradition or precedent or the judgment of the presiding council panel. None of them cited an actual rule. He brought this to Risa the next morning. She brought it to Dale. Dale read the list carefully and then set it aside in his growing documentation file without saying anything dramatic about it, which was somehow more serious than if he had. That same afternoon, Orin called Dale to the administrative wing. The meeting was short. Orin informed Dale, in the precise and pleasant tone that senior council members used when they wanted to sound reasonable while saying something firm, that reinterpreting task parameters was a known and previously rejected approach. He said it with the confidence of someone quoting a rule. Dale asked politely to see the written policy. Orin was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He said that the policy was established through institutional precedent, not a single document. Dale thanked him for the meeting and left. On the way back across campus, he stopped at the junior lab and submitted a formal petition for extended daytime research access through the Academy's standard academic process, a process so old and so rarely used that most of the current administrative staff had never processed one. He submitted it to the General Academic Office, not to the Council directly. It was approved in 2 days by a junior administrator who had no idea it was connected to anything significant. Risa watched Dale file the confirmation and said, very quietly, "You planned that." "I plan to have options," Dale said. "It's a habit." She looked at him for a moment. Outside the lab window, the gold-green sky was deepening into the amber tones of late afternoon, and somewhere across the campus, the junior Shren students were chasing each other again, their laughter a high, rippling sound in the warm air. "What if the council simply says no on the day?" she asked. "What if we follow every rule exactly and they still rule against us?" Dale looked at her, not with false comfort, with something more honest than that. "Then we will have the clearest, most complete record of a valid solution that was rejected without cause in the history of this academy," he said, "and that record will not disappear." It was not the reassurance she had expected, but it was the kind she trusted. She went back to her tests. The council met without telling anyone they were meeting. This was not unusual. Senior panels at the academy held private sessions regularly on scheduling matters, faculty reviews, resource allocation. But this meeting, called at short notice on a rest day evening, had only one item on the agenda: the human instructor and the Draconith student, and what to do about both of them. Orin opened the session. He was calm, as he always was, but the calmness had an edge to it now, the particular tightness of someone who had expected a problem to dissolve on its own and was unhappy that it hadn't. He explained the situation to the 5 other council members. The student, Risa, had received the impossible task 17 days ago. Rather than showing signs of appropriate distress or moving toward a graceful withdrawal, she was running experiments in the junior lab and filing daily documentation updates to the academic record system. Her human teacher had attended a clarification meeting, asked for written policies that did not exist in written form, and then secured extended lab access through a procedural route that no one had thought to block because no one had thought anyone would ever use it. 2 council members were immediately hostile. One said the approach was clearly an attempt to circumvent the spirit of the task, even if the letter of its rules had not been violated. Another said the documentation filing alone was suspicious. Students under the impossible task did not file daily records. There was no rule that said they couldn't, but they didn't. One council member, A broad, quiet Shren named Avos, who had been on the panel longer than anyone, said nothing for several minutes. Then she asked a single question: has the girl broken any written rule? Oren said, not yet. Avos nodded slowly and said nothing else. The council passed a restriction the next morning. All task-related work was to be conducted using Academy laboratory resources during approved daytime hours only. After-hours personal equipment use, which Dale had been doing before the petition came through, was formally revoked. The restriction was written carefully, in precise language, and delivered to Dale's office by a junior administrator who looked uncomfortable. Dale read it. He thanked the administrator. He confirmed with Risa that all their remaining work would be done during daytime hours in the newly petitioned lab space, which it already was. The restriction changed nothing. What it did do was make Risa afraid in a new way, not afraid of the council, exactly, afraid of what it meant that the council was moving at all. Problems that institutions ignored were manageable. Problems that institutions actively tried to contain were different. She was sitting in the lab on the 19th day, running her 14th material configuration test, when two older Draconoth students appeared at the lab door. She knew them by face, fourth-year students, from a prominent family grouping on the Draconoth homeworld. They did not come inside. They stood in the doorway as if they did not want to be seen entering. One of them said, quietly, that she should consider the wider implications of what she was doing, that if she submitted this solution and the council rejected it anyway, she would not simply have failed the task. She would have been seen to challenge the council and lost. That was a different kind of failure, and for a Draconoth at this academy, it carried weight that followed a family for generations. The other one said nothing. He just looked at her with something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning, and then they both left. Risa sat very still for a long time after they were gone. Then she went to Dale's office and told him what they had said. Dale listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her one question: do you think the solution works? She thought about the test results. 14 configurations, 8 failures, 5 partial results, and 1 full-scale model that had held for 6 seconds in simulation before the data collapsed due to a calibration error she had already corrected. She thought about the math, which she had checked 11 times and which kept coming back the same way. Yes, she said, I think it works. Then the question of what the council will do with a working solution is a different question from whether the solution works, Dale said. And I'd rather we solve the first problem completely before we worry too much about the second one. That night, a message arrived from Risa's home world. It was from her family's diplomatic liaison, a formal channel, not a personal one. The message said, in the careful language of Draconoth diplomatic correspondence, that the Council of the Academy had reached out to express concern about Risa's current academic situation, and that the family wished to know if Risa was interested in exploring an honorable withdrawal from the task, which could be arranged without formal record of failure. Risa read the message twice. She thought about her mother, who was an elder of her family line and who had sent Risa here specifically because she believed the Academy was the best place in the known galaxy to become something greater than you already were. She did not reply to the message. She went back to the lab. On the 22nd day, she and Dale completed the full theoretical framework for the solution. It used 11 materials in a specific nested configuration, all rated Class 3 or below, producing emergent shielding properties that the models calculated at 3.4 times the Class 4 threshold. It was not a workaround. It was not a trick. It was real engineering, and the math held. Dale looked at the final numbers for a long time. Then he looked at Risa. How do you feel? He asked. She considered the question seriously, the way Draconoth considered things that mattered. Her fire glands were warm. Her wing membranes, still too small for real flight, were twitching in the way they did when she was holding something large inside her chest. Ready, she said. It was the truest thing she had said in 22 days. The presentation chamber had been designed by someone who understood intimidation. It was circular and deep, like the inside of a bowl, with the student presenting at the very bottom and the council seated along the elevated curved rim above. The walls were smooth and light-colored and bare, which meant there was nothing to look at except the 6 council members looking down at you. The gallery, for observers, faculty, other students, ran along the upper edge behind the council seats, close enough to watch, far enough to feel separate. Risa had been in this chamber twice before for standard year-end reviews. Both times she had been one of a group. This time she was alone. She arrived early. She set up her display model in the demonstration space at the chamber's center, checked the calibrations 3 times, and then stood quietly and breathed the way her mother had taught her, slow, from the base of the fire glands up, letting the warmth settle instead of build. The gallery filled slowly. Torn came in and took a seat in the front row, his heavy Gorath body settling with a sound like a chair being placed on stone. Several junior faculty members she recognized came in after. Then students, more than she expected. Word had spread, the way it always did at the academy when something unusual was happening. Dale came in last. He took a seat in the observer section, 3 rows back from Torn. The rules of the task presentation were clear. The student presented alone. Instructors and advisors sat in observation only. No speaking, no intervention, no assistance. Dale sat down and folded his hands in his lap and looked at her. His expression was the same as it always was, steady. The 6 council members filed in and took their elevated seats. Orin sat at the center. Avos, the old Shren, sat at the far left. The others arranged themselves in between with the practiced stillness of people who had done this many times and expected to be finished quickly. Orin opened the session with a brief statement of the task, parameters for the record. Then he gestured for Risa to begin. She began. She did not start with the solution. She started with the words, the exact wording of the task parameters, line by line, displayed on the chamber's main screen. She explained what each line said. She explained what each line did not say. She was not dramatic about it. She was precise. She had practiced this part more than any other, because this was the part where the ground either held or didn't. When she reached the 3rd parameter, Orin interrupted. The parameters are not in dispute, he said. Proceed to your solution. Risa looked up at him. Council member, I'm establishing the framework by which my solution should be evaluated. The parameters are the standard by which the solution must be judged. I believe their exact wording is directly relevant. Orin looked at her for a moment. He did not say anything else. She continued. She walked them through the material selection, 11 materials, each one individually class 3 or below, each one listed in the Academy's standard registry with its individual rating clearly noted. She displayed the registry entries on screen, cross-referenced against the task parameter that specified individual material rating. She showed the test data from 14 configurations, including the failed ones. She did not hide the failures. She explained what each one had revealed and how it had shaped the design of the next attempt. Then she showed the final configuration. Orin interrupted again, faster this time. The premise that materials in combination can produce properties not inherent to individual components is a reinterpretation of established task methodology. Prior council panels have rejected this approach. Risa looked at him. Her fire glands were warm but steady. Council member, I have reviewed the records of those prior rulings. May I ask which written policy they cite as the basis for rejection? Silence in the chamber. Not a comfortable silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all realize at the same moment that the answer to a question is not what they assumed it would be. Orin said that the rulings were based on established precedent and the collective judgment of prior panels. Risa said, respectfully, that she understood and asked if the council could identify a specific written rule that her methodology violated. From the far left, Avos made a very small sound. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound that meant, let her finish. Orin did not speak again. Risa completed her presentation. The full-scale model activated in the demonstration space at the chamber's center, 11 nested material layers, each individually class 3, arranged in the configuration she and Dale had spent 22 days designing. The containment field expanded outward to its target radius. The calibration matched the anomaly parameters to within 0.3%. It held 4 seconds, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The task requirement was 6 seconds. The field held for 9, and then Risa manually disengaged it because there was no point running it longer. The data was already recorded. The chamber was very quiet. Torn in the front row was absolutely still, but his mineral-flecked surface was catching the light differently than before, which in a Gorath meant something like wonder. Orin declared a 3-day deliberation period, effective immediately. He had the authority to do this. He exercised it in a flat, certain voice, as if this were a normal procedural step and not a delay being used to find a way to undo what had just happened in front of 40 witnesses. Risa accepted this without expression. She powered down the model, collected her data pads, and walked toward the exit. She passed the observer section. She passed Dale without stopping. He gave her a single nod. She kept walking. Behind her, she could already hear faculty members talking, not loudly, not in argument, but in the careful tones of people who had just seen something they needed to think about for a while. 3 days, she could wait 3 days. She had been waiting her whole life to be told what she couldn't do. The 3 days passed differently for different people. For Risa, they passed slowly and quietly. She did not go to the lab. She did not review her documentation. She had done everything she could do, and she understood, in the way that Draconith understood things they had not been told, but could feel in the warmth of the air, that the next 3 days were not hers to control. She spent most of them in the stone courtyard with Torn, who sat beside her in his solid, unhurried way and said very little. The silence of a Gorath was a specific kind of company, heavy and reliable, like sitting beside a wall that would not fall. Once, on the second day, she asked him what he thought the council would decide. Torn was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think the council will do what it believes it can defend, and I think they know now that there are more people watching than they expected." She thought about that. For Dale, those 3 days were different. On the morning of the second day, a message came to his office requesting his presence at a private meeting with the full council panel, all 6 members, which was unusual. Private consultation with an individual instructor outside of formal proceedings was technically within the council's discretionary authority, but it was rarely exercised and almost never for something like this. He went. The meeting room was smaller than the presentation chamber, deliberately so. The 6 council members sat on one side of a long table. Dale sat on the other side, alone. He had brought nothing with him. He did not feel he needed to. Orin was the one who spoke. He was careful, precise, and polite in the way that people are polite when they are trying to offer you something without saying directly that it is an offer. He explained that the council had been reflecting on the situation and that there was a path available, a path that would preserve the integrity of the task tradition, avoid any formal conflict in the records, and ensure that Rice's academic standing was not damaged. What they wanted was simple. If Dale was willing to submit a brief statement acknowledging that his pedagogical guidance in this case had been an instructional error, a well-intentioned but ultimately misdirected approach, then the council would evaluate Risa through an alternative assessment and award her a passing grade through standard channels. No formal failure, no conflict on record. Clean. Dale listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked if this offer was in writing. Orin said it was not. Dale thanked them for the meeting and left. He walked back across campus in the late afternoon light, hands in his pockets, taking the long route past the edge of the lower plateau where the academy grounds dropped away to the valley below. The wind up here was cold and smelled of the mineral dust that the Gorath students carried with them everywhere. He stood there for a while and looked out at the valley and then went back to his office. On the third day, the council announced the ruling in open session. The same chamber, the The same arrangement, student below, council above, gallery watching. Risa stood at the center. Dale sat in observation. Torn was in the front row again, and this time the gallery was nearly full. The word had spread further than Risa had realized. Oren read the ruling. 4 votes to 2. Rice's solution was ruled a valid completion of the impossible task. The chamber did not erupt. There was a moment of very dense silence, and then a low sound moved through the gallery, not celebration exactly, but the collective release of something that had been held for 3 days. Rice stood at the center of the chamber and felt the ruling settle over her like warmth after cold. She did not move. She did not make any sound. Her fire glands were burning steadily, the warmest they had been in 30 days. Oren was not finished. He moved immediately to the second item he had clearly prepared in advance, a formal amendment to the impossible task parameters. The combination methodology loophole, the gap in the wording that did not address material combinations, was to be closed in all future versions of the task. The amendment passed unanimously in less than 2 minutes, and Oren made sure to note for the record that the closing of this gap reflected an effort to clarify the task's original intent and ensure consistent evaluation going forward. He did not say that Rice's solution had been a fluke. He did not need to. The framing did that work for him. Rice listened to this. She did not react. She accepted her passing grade from the administrative officer who approached her afterward with a datapad and a stylus. She signed. She thanked the officer, and then she walked out of the chamber. Dale was waiting in the corridor. She asked him directly, "Does it bother you? They closed it. No one can do what we did again." Dale looked at her. Outside the corridor windows, the gold-green sky was moving toward the amber of late afternoon, the same sky she had stared at on the day the red envelope arrived, but it looked different now for reasons she could not entirely explain. "We didn't do this to create a loophole," Dale said. "We did this to prove it could be done. That proof is in the record. It's in the session documentation, in your test data, in the chamber footage. 40 people watched it happen. The council can close the wording. They cannot close what people saw." Rice thought about that. That evening, a message arrived from her home world. Not from the diplomatic liaison this time. From her mother directly, through a personal channel, which was unusual enough on its own to make Rice's hands pause before she opened it. The message was short. Her mother said she had watched the presentation recording. She said she found it adequate. For a Draconith elder, those 3 words were the equivalent of another species standing in the middle of a crowded room and shouting with both lungs. Risa held the datapad for a long time. On her way back to the dormitory, she passed through the junior corridor where the first-year Draconith students lived. They were small, much smaller than her, barely old enough to speak interstellar common, their wings still soft and colorless at the edges. Several of them were grouped in the hallway, and they all went quiet as she passed. One of the smallest reached out a tiny claw and touched the edge of Rice's wing, briefly, gently. It was the Draconith gesture of deepest respect, the kind given to elders, the kind given to those who had done something worth remembering. Risa did not stop walking, but her fire glands burned all the way back to her room. 1 month after the ruling, the Academy was still pretending nothing had changed. This was the official position. Unofficially, things had changed in the specific way that large institutions change when something cracks them slightly, slowly, in places that didn't seem connected to the crack at all. The Impossible Task Committee had been quietly restructured. 2 of the 4 council members who had voted in Rice's favor had submitted a joint proposal to the Academic Governance Board requesting a formal review of all prior task rulings going back 40 years. The proposal had been accepted. The review was underway. No one had announced this publicly, but it was in the governance records, which were open to faculty, and 3 instructors had already gone looking. Avos, the old Shren Council member who had said almost nothing during both sessions, had submitted a separate document, also quiet, also in the records, noting that the Academy's practice of enforcing tradition without written policy created serious inconsistencies in how students from different species were evaluated. She had been on the council for 26 years. It was the first time she had ever written something like that down. Orin had filed a formal complaint with the Interstellar Academy Governing Board against Dale, citing adversarial interpretation of institutional norms and deliberate undermining of established evaluation tradition. The complaint had been reviewed and closed in 6 days. The governing board's finding was brief. No rules had been violated. They recommended that the Academy review the clarity of its task parameter language going forward. Dale had read this finding on a quiet morning in his office and then filed it in the same folder where he kept everything else related to Rice's task. He kept that folder organized. He suspected he might need to reference it again someday. The requests started in the 3rd week after the ruling. Students came to his office door, different species, different years. A second-year Gorath who was struggling with a lab assessment. A third-year Vel who had received a restriction she thought was unfairly applied. A first-year student from a species Dale had not encountered before, small and copper-colored, who sat across from him and said very simply that she had watched the session recording 6 times and wanted to know how to read rules the way he had taught Ricer to read them. He took them all. He did not have office hours for this. He made them. Torn asked him something different. He came to Dale's office on an evening when the campus was quiet and the amber light was long across the plateau, and he sat down and asked, "What are humans actually like? Not in the profiles, not in the diplomatic records. What are you like?" Dale thought about this for a long time. He finished the last of whatever was in his small metal container. He set it down. "We are the species," he said finally, "that hears the words, 'It's impossible,' and immediately wants to know who decided that, and when, and whether they actually checked." Torn was quiet for a moment. "That sounds exhausting," he said. "It is," Dale said. "It's also how we got here." Torn seemed to consider this with the patience that Gorath brought to everything. Then he nodded, once, in the slow, deliberate way of someone storing something away for later. Rice's advanced placement assignment came through on a plain datapad notification, delivered in the same administrative format as any other schedule update. Xenosystems Engineering, the most competitive track at the Academy, 200 years old, 0 Draconoth graduates in its entire history. She read the notification twice and then sat with it for a while, the way she had sat with the red envelope on the day this all started, except that this time her hands were steady. She brought the new assignment documentation to Dale's office. This had become a habit that neither of them had planned and neither of them had named. She sat down across from him and opened the documents on the display between them. The first assignment was complex. Multi-system, layered constraints, several parameters that intersected in ways that were not immediately obvious. Ricer read through the parameters carefully. She read them the way Dale had taught her, not for what they said on the first pass, but for what they said precisely, and what they did not say, and where the gaps were between the two. She read them slowly. She read them like someone who understood that words in official documents were chosen by people, and that people, however expert and however well-intentioned, did not always close every door they thought they were closing. After a while, she looked up. "Is this one actually impossible?" she asked, "or just written as if it is?" Dale looked at her across the desk. Outside the window, the sky was the deep green gold of early evening, the most familiar color on this world now, the color the sky had been every day she had lived here. The junior Shren students were outside somewhere. She could feel the faint drumming of their feet on the grass below, too far away to hear, close enough to sense. She was not the same student who had held a red envelope and waited a long time before opening it. She was not sure exactly when the change had happened. Somewhere between the first test result and the 9 seconds of held field and the tiny claw of the first-year student touching the edge of her wing. Dale smiled. It was not a complicated smile. It was the smile of someone watching something they had hoped would happen actually happen. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question." Ricer looked back at the documents. She began to read.